And this is Olav, this is Frida, and they are, Olav is, I mentioned him on the coach the other day. He's a guide here, and he teaches guides. And Frida, we're going to lose her, she's going into the armed services. Anyway, but I'm going to turn this right over to them, okay? It's all yours, guys.
Thank you very much, Steve. You know, one guest said to us the other day, to me, why don't you let Frida do all this show instead of you yourself? Because she's way much more of an eye candy than you are. Okay, well, anyway, we are local persons. We are very local. We are actually so local that my home is on the other side of that parking house, and Frida lives across the street from me. We could have been next door neighbors, but we are not next door. We are next window neighbors because we don't have a door at that end of the house. You know, when you are doing an historical entertainment thing like this, there's always this risk that your guests, your audience, maybe they don't like so very well what you're doing. So to make sure that our self-esteem is not going to be lower tonight, we brought our two biggest fans. This one is here and the other one is there. And they're like 15 inches, and that's about as big as they come. This is going to be history lesson. But you know, history can be boring. It's all about dates and names and years and wars and a little piece in between here and there. So we are not at all going to be offended if any of you doze off or go to sleep while we speak. Not that it's happened before, but there's always got to be a first time for everything. And I am sure that you, sir, do not want to be remembered for that.
Whatever you say.
I also had a word with the head waiter upstairs, and we know that 8 of you are booked for 9:15 dinners. Isn't that right? Right. But she said it's perfectly okay if you are 5 or maybe even 10 minutes late, because we promised the talk office to respond to questions when the lecture is over. And if that is a little delay, that's okay with them. But then make sure that those of you who have 7:30 appointments come just as much later as those who had 7:15. Is that okay?
Sure.
Do any of you speak German? No. They have a good expression for that. They say einverstanden, which means, do you agree to this? And apparently you do. So we've invited you here to attend to Norwegian history. This is going to be history class. And this is going to be 10,000 years in 55 minutes. And it's now 6:05.
So, what we're going to be doing today is basically answering 3 questions for you guys. How did the Norwegians get here? What have we been doing here for the past 10,000 years? And why on earth are we still here on the outskirts of the European civilization? Well, the answer, you actually went and saw it today. It lies in our dear beloved glacier. See, we Norwegians have always lived at the rim of the glacier just like we do today. But 10,000 years ago, that glacier up there covered a whole lot more than just the Scandinavian peninsula. It also covered Siberia and Russia, the Baltic states, half of Poland, England, Ireland, Scotland, the islands of the North Sea, and the North Sea itself too, for that matter. The southern rim of the glacier actually went all the way down into northern Germany, and is believed to have stopped someplace between Hamburg and Hanover. Now, the reason we know this is because Norwegian granite was found in this area in Germany, known as Die Luneberger Heide. I don't speak German either, so that might be.
Spell it.
And after some geologists have finished geologizing, they figured that the advancing glacier pushed its rocks in front of it and then left it there when it retreated. So, 10,000 years ago, we Norwegians lived as well as we could at the rim of the glacier, just like we do today, but at that time, someplace between Hamburg and Hanover, when something very strange happened.
The climate changed. The air got warmer. The ice started to melt. and the glacier drew back northerly direction. You can still see it right across over there. You could show one of two reactions to this phenomenon. One option was to lay back in the green grass like this, enjoy the warmer temperatures, listen to the birds sing, watch the grass grow, and wave that glacier goodbye. Now, those who chose this alternative are today known as the Germans. But some of us found it hard to part with this glacier because, after all, it had been our only reliable next-door neighbor since before morning of time. So option number 2 was pretty clear. Get on your feet in pursuit of the glacier. But this pursuit of the glacier lasted several hundred years, several thousand years. And inevitably some fell off during the pursuit. The first who fell off became the Danes. The second who had to give up are now the Swedes. Those who took onto the wrong track and took to the right there, those are the Finns of today. And those who chickened out to the left at the first movement of the ice became the Dutch and the Belgians and the Welsh and the English and the Scottish and the Irish and all the rest. But the tough guys, the hard ones, the patient and enduring, those who would never give up following the glacier, no matter how far north it would retreat. That, my dear guests, that is us Norwegians, and we have been here ever since.
Bravo.
What happened to the Lithuanians?
Pardon?
What happened to the Lithuanians?
They stopped halfway.
Okay.
You see, this is where I got to take off my jacket because I get carried away so easily.
After this, 5,000 years passed without much really happening. We dress in fur and leather and live in caves, and marriage proposals are performed with a wooden magnum club, dragging your wife back to your cave by the hair without even waiting for a simple reply. We didn't know then what we know now, that fishing and hunting are simply meant for sport, recreation, and fun, right? So we Norwegians are today able to state that we survived for 5,000 years on simply leisure time activities.
That would not have been possible today. I do have to admit, however, I did try it myself for a year, but it didn't work, said my wife.
Then around 3,800 years ago, some other smart, clever guy finds a metal called copper. And then he mixes this metal copper with a thing called tin, and he creates bronze. So with this new metal bronze, he immediately started calling life the Bronze Age, as you do. And he also started creating useful remedies that he would need for certain tasks. You know, what we would today call tools. So he'd make an axe to chop down a tree, a spade to dig a hole in the ground. He even made a plow to cultivate a field. And this man was kind of smart. He furthermore thought that if he could bring the wild animals from the forest into his own backyard, keep them there and feed them there so they would stay over the winter, he wouldn't have to dig around in the sticks and the boonies every time he wanted something to eat. So by doing this, farming was now an act and work was invented. Yay!
If I could have just one word with that guy. June 7th, 793 Anno Domini was a beautiful day. Way better than this. Not a cloud in sight. Just a high, clear, blue Nordic sky, and the sun was shining when 12:15 young, strong, healthy Norwegian men were on their way home in an open boat after fishing or hunting or whatever they had been doing at the coast exactly 100 kilometers west of us right here and now. And that is like
64 miles.
64 miles. That's quite a ways. But since the weather was so nice and the wind was just right, they decided to go for a little boat ride just for the fun of it before returning home. And this little boat ride just for fun back in 793 lasted 5 days before something very unexpected and strange happened. They approached land there and they didn't recognize the surroundings and they didn't recognize the people who came down to the beach there to greet them. Slowly the Norwegians understood that as long as we don't know this land and we don't know these people, this cannot be home, this cannot be Norway, and the only credible alternative they could come up with was that this must be somewhere else, like abroad or a foreign country. Well, we know now these people they called foreigners. They had landed at Holy Island, a 5 square kilometer big island east of the Northumbrian coast of England, in Norwegian known as Lindisfarne. And the people who came down to the beach there to greet them were the monks from the monastery at Holy Island, Lindisfarne. And you know something? This has been puzzling me with the English language for the past 50 years or so. Because in English, a convent for women may be called a nunnery, right? I mean, so why is not a convent for men a monkery? I mean, I don't know this. I mean, this is your language. This is your language. We are just trying to use it here. Furthermore, the Norwegians realized that if they were going to convince those who waited at home and couldn't come for this little about what they had found, seen, discovered, and experienced, they needed to bring home some very, very convincing articles of documentation. Now, articles of documentation was the terminology back in those days for what we now call souvenirs. But the monks at the monkery at Holy Island Lindisfarne were somewhat reluctant to let go of their precious metal drinking utensils and candelabers and chandeliers and decorations of the monastery there, so there might be this little theoretical chance that the Norwegians had to kill a few of them a little in order to obtain these souvenirs. And while this is being negotiated over, a piece of burning firewood fell out of the open fireplace at the monastery there, and all of a sudden the house catches fire. And you, my dear guests, know just as well as I what happens whenever a house catches fire. People congregate to watch out of curiosity, right? And where people congregate to watch out of curiosity is always this majority of women. Now, picture the situation. 12, 15 young, strong, healthy Norwegian men running from the burning monastery at the top of the hill there, with their arms full of souvenirs like this, heading for the boat down at the beach, and all of a sudden they can see, there are women on this island too. And they thought that women here, or women at home, is probably pretty much the same thing. They had no possible way of knowing up front that the young English girls back in those days had a different point of view on these so-called pre-marriage, uncommitting, casual, sexual relationships than they did. What we today would call a good one-night stand, right? And you know, the day after, the Norwegians were notoriously known throughout the world for murder and killing and arson and fire and robbery and theft and violence and rape and you name it, and the Norwegians did it as long as it was bad enough. But
It really was an accident. I mean, we never intended for this to happen. You have to remember that this was our first encounter with foreigners in a foreign country. Up until this day, we had believed that everything you see is Norway and everyone you meet is a Norwegian, and then all of a sudden this proves no longer to be true. We were acting out of pure insecurities. We just simply didn't know how to behave. It was definitely an accident, I'm telling you that. Now, in his main works, A History of the English-Speaking Peoples, Sir Winston Spencer Leonard Churchill writes in Volume 1, The Birth of Britain, pages 109 through 111, if you don't believe me, that the Norwegians are ruthless barbarians without refinement and culture. Okay. That's easy for Sir Winston to say, born and raised on Blenheim Castle with a silver spoon in his mouth. The guy didn't have a faintest notion of what it was like to feel insecure in front of foreigners. I certainly think he could have shown a little more consideration to this accident that happened at Holy Island back in 793. Now, in our small boats, we went down the rivers of Dnieper, Don, and Volga, through the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea. We founded Novgorod. We went through the Bosporus and the Mediterranean, learned everything we could about the North African coast, and everything we could about the South European coast as well. So not only were we Norwegians the first cruise ship passengers, which we were also the second imperialists, given the fact that the Romans had been the first, of course. Now, the Norwegian word for island is øy. It's that weird O-looking letter with a dash through it, and then a Y afterwards, øy. And that's why we still have names of places like Færøy, Orknøy, Guernsey, Jersey. In Germany, they have Greifswalderøya. Because at this point in history, we Norwegians had also colonized every big and small island in the North Sea. Now, we started up Dublin to give the Irish a good start in life, founded York in England to give the English an easier go of it. And yes, I've heard that we weren't the first to put a man on the moon. Say the Americans did that. But don't you, my dear guests, ever dare to forget that we Norwegians discovered America 500 years before Columbus did by Leif Eriksson's expedition, so that the Americans could be the first to put a man on the moon. I say we had something to do with that too, didn't we?
In the year 911, wanted the Norwegian sea captain Gange Rolf to go to France on a cruise. His name was Gange Rolf because he was a big man. He was a huge person. Gange is the Norwegian verb for to walk on foot like this. And his name was Gange Rolf because he could, believe you me or not, tiptoe while on horseback.
That's good.
So he could take a little weight off his own enormous body with his own two legs whenever it got too steep for his poor horse under there. But then don't forget that the horses were smaller than two. A lot smaller. Like the size of a Saint Bernard dog or something. But anyway, you may recognize him under the Latin form of his name. He was Rollon. And Rollon was born in Ålesund, which is like just 2.5 hours drive northwest of us right here and now. Anyway, Rollon went to France on this cruise in 911, and he was met on the banks of northern France by the king of the Franks, Charles the Simple-Minded. Charles the Simple-Minded immediately offered him the grounds on which he was standing and the nearest surroundings if he could settle down peacefully instead of going raping and pillaging cross over France in this Viking way of vacationing. Now, Roland accepted this offer, and do you know what this part of France still is called today? Right, Normandy. The Normans were there. He also later became the great-grandfather of William the Conqueror. Before the deal could be sealed, however, he first needed to kiss the French king's foot. But not being too familiar with the international diplomatic protocol at the time, and not having the faintest notion of the idea of submission in this context, he kind of grabbed the French king's foot by the ankle like this, threw it up on the air so he fell flat on his back there, kissed it, let go of it, and rode around to conquer the area, defined such as far as his men could ride in a day. I have given this situation a second thought, and I have reached the conclusion that Rollon must have been the man behind the idea of how to unload and load on to a docking ship in a fast and swift manner, because this is still called roll on, roll off. Must be named after him.
Then comes September 26th in
25th. Don't tamper with the dates, young lady.
25th in 1066, when the English king Harold Godwinson was expecting holiday visitors from Norway by boat and had prepared a reception for them at the Stamford Bridge. Now this must have been a really well-rehearsed reception, because none of the Norwegian cruise ship passengers were ever seen back in Norway again. Even the tour escort himself, King Harald the Hard Ruler, was lost. And after this, we started to see that our Viking way of vacationing had become a little dangerous. Also, some 70 years prior to this incident,
70 years.
in 997, 7 years, Christendom was introduced to Norway, as the only legal and acceptable religion of this country. And even though it took them quite a while, the Norwegians slowly started to see that the message from the gospel didn't quite go hand in hand with the message they were sending out on their Viking way of vacationing. So we eventually gave up the whole Viking thing. But are y'all familiar with the English term branding, right? Building knowledge around trademark. We Norwegians were Vikings for only 275 years. But still today, 952 years later, that is all the world can remember us for. And if that isn't good branding, then show me what is. Now, we Norwegians are really very progressive people. We love to develop our country and our people and be ahead in all kinds of development. But we Norwegians are also very loyal to traditions. Actually, we're so loyal to traditions that all kinds of Norwegian development needs to happen based on one condition. Everything must remain as it is with no changes, please. That is the definition of Norwegian development. And at this point in history, the Germans had started building the cogs. You know, those tall, beautiful ships that had like 2 to 3 masts, and they'd plow right through the waves instead of going over them like our longships did. Longships, so those long Viking ships, yeah. But that wasn't the traditional way of building a ship. That wasn't what a traditional ship was supposed to look like. So while this was happening, we Norwegians just kind of stood there, hands thrust deeply into our pockets, shaking our heads laughing, going, "Come on, Germans, what do you mean? That's not what a ship's supposed to be looking like. Ha ha ha." And we lost the power of the sea overnight.
Which didn't really matter all that much, because in the early 1200s, Bergen, our capital here in the west, became a member of the Hanseatic Merchant League. And if I'm not mistaken, Xavier, you were in Bergen 2 days ago?
Yeah.
So you know all about this thing, right? We now had regular sailings and ship connections with all the important cities throughout Northern Europe, such as Tallinn and Riga and Visby on Gotland, you know this big island between Sweden and Finland there, Gdansk, now Poland, Rostock, Lübeck, Hamburg, Bremen, Ghent, Bruges and London. And we started to export. And what do you think we exported?
Fish and
Right, fish. Are you all familiar with the international term called stockfish? Everybody knows what stockfish is? No, okay. It's a cod. The ideal size is between 3 and 7 kilos. And when the head has been chopped off and the innards are taken out and it's been rinsed, it's being thoroughly salted so that the fillets stay together at the tail there, and then they're hung up to dry in the sun and the wind on these racks bigger than houses. I'm sure you must have seen pictures of those, haven't you? The Portuguese met us in Bremen, and they were so delighted about the Norwegian stockfish that still today, more than 800 years later, is the Norwegian stockfish the basic ingredient in the national traditional dish of the Portuguese, known as louder. Bacalhau. You are so right, madam. You just saved the honor of the whole group here. No good traditional Portuguese national bacalhau without Norwegian stockfish as the basic ingredient. We had a couple of good friends once who were Portuguese. It was a married Portuguese couple. Unfortunately, they are divorced now, so he is a Portugoose. Before they were married, when he was still single, he used to be a Portugander. And they have 3 nice little Portugoslings, 1 of each. What do you think was Norway's second most important article of exportation back in those days?
lumber.
Lumber, right, sir. Timber. You know, here with us, it takes like 100 years for a spruce or a pine to reach the height of 30-some meters, and the wood is hard as rock. Because, you know, after all, the roots are frozen 3 months a year, right? We could now deliver masts to the shipyards in all these important cities throughout Northern Europe that I just mentioned to you. And this also brought on a new way of shipbuilding here, because now the mast could be mounted directly onto the keel instead of lower and upper deck like before, and that would make your vessel a whole lot more stable in a windstorm. Oh, this little country made a fortune on this product. What do you think was our export article number 3 if you look behind you? Granite, stone, right. Remember, that was ballast back in those days. And if you cut it right, like the size of a brick or something, you couldn't only stable it steadily in the hull of your ship, but the best thing was you could sell it when you didn't need it anymore. Do you realize that the streets of Amsterdam, Holland, Antwerp, Belgium, and Lübeck, Germany are still today paved with Norwegian bridgestone from these days? And that is a matter of fact. And we started to import. And what do you think we imported?
Salt from the mines of Krakow in Poland. You know, we needed that to make our stockfish. We also imported textiles, musical instruments, ceramics, glass, porcelain, and Dutch gin. The Dutch gin was known as Genever, and it would come inside of these ceramic bottles sometimes, and that would be called the surprise bottle, because you had no idea when it was empty. And when it was, you made a table lamp out of it. I'm sure you must have seen at least one. It says balls with big blue letters on it. Every Norwegian house, I guarantee you they have one. I think we have 5.
We have
No.
6.
Yeah. We've now reached a point in history where we are 675,000 Norwegians in this world, and we were doing just fine for a couple hundred years, up until August in 1349, when a Spanish ship comes sailing from London, docks in Bergen, and brings to Norway the plague. The Black Death, as we call it up here. Now, in 2 years, 2/3 of our entire population is completely wiped out. So when 1351 comes, we're merely 150,000 Norwegians left in this world. And who can form a strong nation with 150,000 individuals, all scattered over a coastline of 25,148 kilometers? We could not. It took us a couple hundred years to get back on our feet again, but by that time it was already too late. Because in 1380 had the last Norwegian king, King Haakon, married the Danish princess Margaret. And as all Scandinavians who married, they had of course arranged for joint property. So that meant that from 1380 on, Norway and Denmark were the same kingdom. Now if someone would have the guts to tell this guy about prenup, this wouldn't have happened. But guess no one wanted to. Now, Håkon and Margaret, they only had one child. They named him Olav, but unfortunately he only lived to be 17 years old. And when he passed away, that happened only 16 years after his father had. So that meant that all the successors to the Danish-Norwegian throne, they were from Margaret's side of the family, which was the Danish royal house. So yeah. Now, Queen Margaret actually did one last thing of importance for us Norwegians before she died on board her ship in 1412, which was to sign the Kalmar Union. It was signed in the Swedish city of Kalmar, hence the name. It happened in 1397, and it basically states that all 3 Scandinavian countries, so Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, were to be ruled out of Copenhagen. But that for us right here and now means that the following 434 years, they're Danish history, not Norwegian history. And since we're dealing with Norwegian history, we're going to skip right up to 1814.
1814 was a very exciting year for Norway because this spring 112 equally elected men had been gathered for as many days in the little village of Eidsvoll, which nowadays is like 45 minutes drive north of Oslo. They had been spending this time to prepare for the Norwegian Declaration of Independence and Fundamental Constitution, working after the French and the American as patterns. They also agreed with the Danish-Norwegian prince Christian Frederick that he should remain in Norway as the king in a free, independent and sovereign state instead of a representative of his father's administration in Copenhagen, which he had been up to now. On May 17th that year, the Norwegian Declaration of Independence and Fundamental Constitution solemnly proclaimed, and May 17th is still celebrated as our Independence Day, always with flags and banners and music and parades and picnicking and dancing and full hearts and empty bottles towards the end of the evening. It's way worse than 4th of July. Are any of you from the mid or northern northwest? You are? Okay. 1.5 hours drive south of Madison, Wisconsin, you'll find this nice little farm village by the name of Stoughton. Stoughton, Wisconsin, it's like an hour north of the Illinois border. That's Norway's official capital in the United States. And they have what they call the 17. Mai festival, and they celebrate May 17th for 3 consecutive days. Now we have more than enough with one. And I've been there twice, celebrating with them. And half an hour's drive northwest of Stoughton is this little village by the name of New Glarus. Mainly Swiss population, I think, or population of Swiss descendants. And they have a brewery there, and they make this beautiful beer by the name of Spotted Cow. Spotted Cow can be bought and sold in Wisconsin only. And I'm a beer connoisseur, so I know what I'm talking about. Spotted Cow of Wisconsin, USA is the 3rd best beer in the world. And while celebrating, well, I do have to confess, we spotted a few cows that night. But you know, era minne din nog.
1814 was an exciting year for the rest of Europe as well. You know, Napoleon was now back in Paris, and the Russian Tsar wanted to form a union against him with the other European state leaders, remembering just too well what had happened in the years of the Napoleonic Wars from 1807 through 9. Now, in order to first create this union against him, the Russian Tsar needed to make peace between the Norwegian Danish king and the Swedish king, because at this point they had had a 30-year ongoing, long, destructive conflict between them. And they wouldn't enter the same union, even though they both wanted to enter a union against Napoleon, because the feud they had between each other. But you know, the Danish-Norwegian king, he was, as usual, flat broke, couldn't offer the Swedish king anything. And that was okay for the Swedish king, because all that he wanted as war replacement.
War reparation.
War reparation.
Isn't that the right English word? War
Yeah.
reparation.
Thank you,
Very good.
sorry. Was Norway. He felt that was pretty fair, since it was the Danish-Norwegian king's predecessor that had been the aggressor in this case. And so Norway was a fair claim to him. The Danish-Norwegian king couldn't really offer him anything else because he didn't have anything else to offer. So 1814 turned out to be an incredibly sad year for us Norwegians. Because instead of gaining freedom, sovereignty, independence, like we'd hoped for and dreamt of and planned for, we now became Swedes.
That was bad.
Yeah.
Now, Frida here and I, we've been exercising, we've been rehearsing, we've been trying to pronounce the word Swede with the same passion and emotion as Jerry Seinfeld says, "Hello, Newman." But I don't think we're quite there yet.
We're not.
We're gonna be working on it.
We'll keep working on it. We'll get it one day. Now, Napoleon, yeah, he had a general at his staff. His title was Field Marshal, and he was one of 7 chiefs in command. His name was Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte. And Bernadotte and Napoleon, they had been quite good friends during the First Napoleonic Wars. But after Napoleon got back from his exile at Elba, Bernadotte had, in the meantime, married one of his former mistresses that went by the name of Desiree Clary. So let's just say they weren't really friends anymore. Now Napoleon actually wanted to get rid of Bernadotte, but he had quite a lot of opposition in France already. And Bernadotte, I can tell you, he must have been quite the personality. He had family history from the low aristocracy. He was highly educated, a gentleman, a womanizer like you should never know his like. But probably the most important thing was that he was considered to be one of the brightest minds within military strategy for his time. So people like Bernadotte, Napoleon didn't, but he couldn't get rid of him because he already had too much opposition in France. What do you do then? You do the second worst thinkable thing you could ever do to someone, which is to send them to Sweden. So he sent Bernadotte to Sweden. He sent him as an ambassador, and Bernadotte actually got quite popular over there. Actually, you know, unlike the rest of the world, Norway, we've never had a formal aristocracy. Titles like Lord and Duke and Baron and all that, completely meaningless to us. I don't think we even know how to spell the word feudalism, because we just never had the need to. As close as you could get to titles in this little country is basically farmer and housewife, because every guy had his own little piece of land. He was just as free as the next guy, but also just as poor. And so we've never really had to deal with any of those titles that comes with the aristocracy. The Swedes, however, they've had aristocracy. They still do. Around every 1,000 Swede is a greve, which is a lord, a duke. And, I mean, it doesn't really matter for much except for property tax, but they won't keep doing it, let them do it. They're Swedes, we don't really care. But at this point in history, the aristocracy, it did matter. You know, the aristocracy were the only people allowed to vote on political issues. So when the last Swedish king, King Charles XIII, passed away in 1818 from a mental disease following inbreed, the Swedes actually elected...
Without any natural successors to the throne.
Yeah. The Swedes actually elected Generalambassadör Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte to become the next king of Sweden and Norway. Now, when he was elected king, he immediately changed his name to Karl Johan, which is a Scandinavian form of Charles John. And even though he never learned to speak a single word Norwegian or Swedish his entire life, maybe you could say "tack." Do you guys know what "tack" means? Yeah. You know as much as he did. He actually became a quite popular monarch of this country because he was the one who in the year of 1821 granted Norway autonomy. He was also the one who had our royal palace built in 1824. And when you're in Oslo, you're going to be staying at the Hotel Bristol, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when you walk out the front doors of that hotel, you're going to be right on Karl Johans gata, which is Charles John Street. That's Norway's parade street, basically, and it leads right up to the royal castle at the end of it. And in front of the royal castle, there's this big statue there of this man sitting on his horse in his uniform, looking very proud. And that's Karl Johan. Underneath it reads a slogan, which says that the gratitude of my peoples, because he had two, you know, is my reward.
1830, and we now reach the first million of Norwegians in this world. 1860, 30 years later, we reach the second million. We have actually doubled the population in 30 years. And still people keep asking us, what do you Norwegians do up there on the outskirts of the European civilization in the midst of a cold and long and dark and cold winter? I mean, read the statistics, man. Isn't that pretty obvious? I mean, in the summer, we fish and make babies. In the winter, we don't fish all that much. 1884, and this little country had pretty much everything a self-running nation needs. We lacked only a Ministry of Defense, a Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and a king. The Swedes took care of that for us, and up to now that had been fairly okay, because you know, after all, that is what costs money in running a state, right?
Right.
The mayor of Bergen, his name was Christian Mikkelsen, and I think you saw his statue at a lake in the center of Bergen 2 days ago, didn't you? He also later became the first prime minister of Norway. He felt it was about time to start some negotiations with the Swedish-Norwegian king Oscar II and grandson of Bernadotte. But Oscar II was somewhat reluctant to let go of Norway because, after all, we didn't cost him much money. We were a neat income source for him as far as money goes, and maybe the most important thing for him back in those days was that we provided him with the best soldiers and marksmen in Europe. In the spring of 1905, the situation was really tense. So politicians and diplomats were gathered around the negotiation table in the Swedish city of Karlstad. Karlstad was chosen because that is exactly halfway between Oslo and Stockholm. Soldiers were lined up on both sides of the border, from Halden in the south to Trondheim in the north, ready to act on orders in case these negotiations should go wrong. Can you imagine what a mess military activity would have been in a situation like this? I mean, technically, the soldiers came from the same nation, so the uniforms were identical on both sides of the border. The officers came from the same staff. You would actually have to tiptoe up to the first and best soldier you saw and tap his shoulder and say, hey, can you talk to me so I can hear your dialect because I need to know whether I'm going to shoot you or defend you? Well, this is really how stupid the situation was. And even King Oscar II of Sweden and Norway realized this stupidity, and on June 7th that very same year, he finally set Norway free. June 7th is still National Flagging Day with us in respectful remembrance of this event. Now, right after this, we arranged for the first referendum in this young nation's history. And the issue was, should we now become a republic, or would we rather stay a monarchy even if the last Norwegian king was dead 500 years before this? Well, you may not believe this, but the results for monarchy were 21,778. And the votes for republic were 481. And that is pretty convincing. Now Norway finds herself in the funniest, strangest, straight out more laughable situation any Western civilization has ever been in. An internationally acknowledged and recognized free, independent and sovereign state and nation. A self-proclaimed monarchy. But no king, no queen, no prince, no princess, not even an aristocracy where we could pick one. Now what do? We sent a delegation to Copenhagen and asked the unemployed Danish Prince Carl if he would like to come to Norway and become our king. He was unemployed because he had an older brother who was supposed to take over the Danish throne. And I remember his only argument against, and this is how he phrased it, if I go to Norway and I become king of Norway, that shall leave me with very limited possibilities for a future career advancement. But King of Norway was good enough for him, and November 25th, 1905, he for the first time set foot on Norwegian soil, bringing with him his wife, the English Princess Maud, daughter of Edward and Alexandra, after whom this hotel is named, by the way, and grandchild of Albert and Victoria, remember? And their 2-year-old son Alexander. Now, he immediately changed his name to Håkon, which sounds a whole lot more Norwegian, added a number 7 after it as the 7th regent in Norwegian history by that name. His son's name was changed to Olav, and I can well understand why. It's a beautiful name, don't you think? Oh, thank
Really
you.
is, yes.
Thank you, thank you. But his wife remained Maud for the rest of her life because you can never, ever persuade an Englishman to change anything. They are so conservative, the English, that I even suspected them for having invented the idea of conservatism itself. Now you let that one sink in. Maud died in 1938 at the age of 68 from cancer, and Håkon lived the rest of his life alone.
Officially.
Officially.
Some of us know better.
Yeah.
Most of us know better.
At the Amsterdam Olympics 1928, Crown Prince Olav of Norway won the Olympic gold medal for regatta sailing. Only one other royal person has done this. Do you know who? None of you of Greek descendants? Constantine of Greece, 1960 in Rome, also for sailing. And the year after, we are now in 1929, our crown prince married his first cousin, Princess Martha of Sweden. That was a controversial marriage, I can tell you. Not that they married another royal person. I mean, that was common back in those days. I mean, and it has always been, probably still is. I mean, we had been doing this since we first started organizing independent states with international borders, right? I mean, by marrying across international borders, you would secure peace and diplomacy. I mean, who would invade the neighboring state by military force as long as his own brother-in-law was the state leader there? Well, his mother-in-law, I could understand that, but not his mother. But the fact that she was Swedish. At first, the Norwegians never really took Marta to their hearts, if you see what I mean with the expression. But over the years, they respected the free and independent choice of the beloved crown prince so much that it was eventually okay.
Then comes Tuesday, April 9th in 1940. At 4 o'clock in the morning are the cities of Oslo and Narvik simultaneously attacked by the Nazis. And this came as a total shock to us Norwegians. I mean, what is this? Friends, business partners, practically neighbors, all of a sudden attacking us by military force without even as much as a declaration of war first. This was unheard of, and it took most Norwegians a couple of days to even be able to understand what was going on in the situation. Now, the idea behind the attack was something the Nazis called Weserübung. And their goal was basically to secure Norway's coastal line. Because the Nazis, they had iron up in this mine in North Sweden in the city of Kiruna. So they take the iron out of Kiruna, bring it over to Norway, take it down our coastal line and into Germany, where it would fuel the German war machine that was at the Alfred Krippwerke in Essen in Germany. They also wanted to capture our royal family and our elected government and to take our gold reserves. But due to some very, very improvised resistance, our royal family and elected government were able to get on the run, and were on the run for 2.5 months as fugitives in their own countries, with the Nazis following them 2 meters behind them, until the English Royal Marines were able to get them out on June 7th by the coastal cities of Molde and Tromsø. So they went over Shetland and the Orkneys and into England, where the next day our king announced over BBC radio that Norway was now in an exile government. But that turned out to be a hopelessly inefficient exile government, because the previous Minister of Defense, his name was Vidkun Quisling, he believed in the Nazi regime and decided that him and a couple of his other Nazi friends would take over the vacant offices of the elected government now that they had fled the country and rule Norway as a Nazi regime. He declared himself the Ministerpresident of Norway, but Ministerpresident Vidkun Quisling, he didn't get along with Hitler's guy in Norway. Even though they were both Nazis, they weren't friends. Hitler had sent Josef Terboven, and our historians say that it was the cold relationship between Quisling and Terboven that's actually the reason why it went Norway so well during World War II, considering the losses of civilians in this country compared to other European countries. I mean, I think the worst thing that happened to us during World War II was in the winter of 1944, when the Soviet Union Army, or the Red Bear as they were called, got over and tried to invade and take Norway back from the north. But you know, the military mind of Nazi Germany was kind of brilliant, so they'd already foreseen this situation and evacuated some 60,000 Norwegians from up north, taking them down here to us in the south, and used the strategy of scorched earth on everything up there. They burnt down everything. All the infrastructure, all the houses, everything that people had was completely gone. The only thing that stood left were the church buildings. So when the Soviet Union Army came over, they didn't have anywhere to seek shelter. And this winter has actually been called Norway's coldest, darkest, snowiest winter of all time. So the Soviet Union Army had to return back with great losses. You know, for the Jews, the Norwegian Jews during World War II, it was of course a different story. In February of 1942, 772 Norwegian Jews were captured and sent to concentration camps in Poland and Germany. And at the end of World War II, only 34 of those came back to Norway alive. Now, in Norway, as a Norwegian person during World War II, it wasn't necessarily the German Nazi soldier that was dangerous to you, by those means of the word. They were all polite men, wearing uniform. You could all see who they were. And so unless you did anything to break their rules, you weren't in danger, because they were stationed in Norway on a peacekeeping mission. Now, the dangerous people to us Norwegians were the Norwegian Nazi. They wouldn't wear a uniform. You had no idea who they were. It could be your own next door neighbor or your mother, and you would have no clue. And of course, the German Gestapo, but they were dangerous to the Nazis themselves, so. They actually had this Nacht- und Nebel-Taktik, they called it, which is the strategy of night and fog, which meant that they would show up at your door at 4 in the morning. You'd have to get out of bed, and when you open the door, in front of you would stand these 2 tall guys dressed in leather and hats and big round glasses, and they'd say,
"You are under arrest."
"Now why am I under arrest?"
Because it is being said that you have a radio, and keeping a radio is a crime these days.
"And who told you I keep a radio?"
Your neighbor 2 houses down the street. Stuff like that was bad. That was mean. That was straight out ugly. At the morning of the invasion, Crown Princess Märtha of Norway brought her 3 children across to Sweden to seek shelter with her family there. But the Swedish king wouldn't know her, because he felt that if he gave asylum to wanted Norwegian number 3 next after her father-in-law and her husband, he would jeopardize Sweden's neutrality during World War II. So they got around to the center north in Finland, to a city by the name of Petsamo, and got around to an American ship and got him safely across to Washington, D.C., where Crown Princess Märtha of Norway and her 3 children were private guests in the home of Eleanor and Franklin D. Roosevelt for 5 years. When peace was declared in Europe on May 8, 1945, Crown Prince Olav flew straight back from London to Oslo to take charge of the operation that we called the disarmament of the occupying forces, which was quite a job to take on, because on this very day, 400,000 German soldiers were standing under arms on Norwegian soil. And you know something? Not one single shot was fired. He performed this excellently and gained a lot of respect on this maneuver. In the following, 1 month later, also June 7th, the king and the royal family came back from England and the United States, but the gold reserves of Norway's National Bank are still kept in the vaults of Bank of England. And I certainly hope they haven't spent too much of it. Having been members of the European Union for some 40 years now, I'm kind of skeptical, but let's hope it's all still there. When peace was declared in Europe on May 8, 1945, 236,000 Norwegian individuals were arrested under suspicion of treachery, high treason, collaboration, fraternizing with the enemy, and war profiting. After half a year of trials, a little less than half of them, 93,000 persons, are convicted to anything from death penalty to 3 months forced labor. Minister President Vidkun Quisling and 30 of his Norwegian Nazi ministers were executed at the lawn in front of the Akershus Castle in the center of Oslo in the early hours of October 24th, 1945, together with 15 German Gestapo. And that, my dear guests, was the last death penalty that was carried out in Norway, both in peace and in wartime.
Now, among those 236,000 that was arrested in Norway after the war, that actually made up 8% of our adult population at the time. Because we had, in 1942, reached our 3rd million Norwegians in this world. And why do you think it took us so long to go from 2 to 3 million? I mean, we spent 30 years doubling the population to go from 1 to 2. We didn't go fishing more, that's not it. Do you have any idea why it might have taken us so long? Something happened between the years of 1865 and 1910. Around 1 million Norwegians emigrated for the new America, and only about 200,000 of those who left came back to Norway. And do you know why they all settled in the Midwest? We have actually, we're so sure of it that it's not even a theory anymore. We know why. Do you guys know why?
No guesses? Why did all the Norwegian immigrants settle in the Midwest and Northwest?
Climate.
Climate?
Yeah, it's got something to do with
yeah,
that.
partly. Any better suggestions?
Good farmland.
Farmland is, yes, that too.
Our way of phrasing it is that the soil there is just as poor as it is back home.
On the very same date as he first came to Norway, November 25th, but 52 years later, we're in 1957, King Haakon VII of Norway silently passed away in his chambers in his royal palace in Oslo at the age of 85, and he died from a lung inflammation after having broken his hip. An elderly lady in the neighborhood where I grew up, she loved her king very much. She felt it was partly his own fault that he got sick and died because he had broken his hip in his bathtub on a Tuesday. Now, what on earth did a man have to do in his bathtub on a Tuesday? I mean, we do stuff like that on Fridays and Saturdays here. No, this was as good as suicide. He was immediately succeeded to the throne by his only son Olav, who at this time had been a widower for 3 years. And Olav really became a beloved and respected monarch of this country because he was a king from, for, and with his people. We'll give you an example in a second.
Before that, we need to talk about something very important that happened to this little country on December 23rd in 1969. Do you guys have any idea what might have happened?
Oil.
Yep.
Yep.
Phillips Petroleum struck oil in Norway's sector of the North Sea. We started to build our first oil field there that was ready in 1971, called Ekofisk, and it was the biggest oil field in the world when it was ready. And I mean, it's no secret that the oil has helped us Norwegians a lot financially. At that time, it actually was really significant to our economy because that meant we were now able to fund our welfare state that we dreamed of since the 1920s, so we could give our people free healthcare and education and pension funds and all those goods with a lot lower income tax rates. They were actually lowered by some 20% after we found the oil. So that made
over the last
happy.
40 years, it's gone down by 20%.
Yeah.
So we're now like 38% income tax. When I had my first job, it was 54. Any of you old enough to remember? Sorry.
Okay. You were taking so long, I was like, what? Go ahead.
Are any of you old enough to remember the oil crisis of 1973?
Yes.
Okay, good. Remember the Suez Canal was blocked and we had a general shortage of oil and gas throughout the Western world? And the Norwegian government came up with a thing that they called car-free Sundays. But in order to save gas, there was a general prohibition against driving your own private car between Fridays at 6 p.m. until Mondays at 6 a.m., which was quite a nice thing to do because you could now go for Sunday walks for hours and hours and hours, and then you wouldn't, the only car or the vehicle in motion you would see would be the service bus, but the service bus doesn't run on Sundays, so you wouldn't see that one either. Well, anyway, there's this photographer in Norway's second biggest newspaper at the time who captured a picture of King Olav V of Norway one early December Sunday morning in 1973, sitting in a subway car downtown passengers. No security guards, no safety guards, no friends, no family. Just the old man there by himself with his skis in one hand and his poodle Charm on his lap. And the day after he said to the press, of course, as long as we Norwegians are not allowed to drive our own private cars for leisure time purposes, I'm loyal to that, of course. I mean, but it was such a beautiful day, and both I and my dog needed so badly to go cross-country skiing in my favorite area behind the Holmenkollen ski jump there north of the city. Security guards? What the heck? I have 4.5 million of them. And that picture, that tells a whole lot more about his personality than any lecturer possibly can convey in words in a simple lecture like this. No wonder that the country was grieving deeply on the very same day as the first Gulf War broke out. Do you remember Desert Storm?
Yep.
January 17th, 1991, when King Olav V of Norway silently passed away in his bedroom, in his cottage in the mountains. Well, it's actually a little mansion, but he liked to call it his cottage in the mountains. And he was 89 years old. He was immediately succeeded to the throne by his only son Harald, who back in 1968 had married a commoner, Sonja Haraldsen, daughter of an Oslo businessman. Now, Sonja and Harald are our king and queen today. They are both 81 years old this year, or they were 81 this year, and they have 2 children. The eldest is Märtha Louise. She is 47. And Märtha Louise married a commoner too back in 2000. His name is Ari Behn, and he's a Norwegian entertainer and an author and actor. And what you saying, Frida? I don't know what it's not. And they have 3 daughters. Back in 2002, Märtha Louise resigned from a royal title because she did not want to become queen. And she wanted to be an ordinary businesswoman, which she still is, meaning that she has to provide for herself, which she does excellently. Her birthday is no longer National Flagging Day, and the title princess is used only by the media to focus on her. She doesn't use that herself anymore. 2 years ago, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Ari Behn and our Märtha Louise, they announced that they were going to have a divorce. And that is the first divorce in a Scandinavian royal family since 1824, when the Danish crown prince Christian Frederick kicked out his wife for having played more than the piano with a music teacher.
Our crown prince is Märtha's 2-year younger brother named Håkon Magnus.